The trauma bay doors burst open, not for a patient, but for her. 6 soldiers in full combat gear stormed past stunned doctors, weapons slung, eyes locked on one woman in faded scrubs they'd fired 3 weeks earlier. The hospital's chief of surgery froze mid-sentence. A team leader ripped off his helmet and said the words that silenced the entire emergency room. "Stand down. Everyone. You're looking at the medic who kept my men alive in Kandahar." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The nurse they'd humiliated, mocked, and thrown away was about to remind this hospital exactly who she really was. Before we dive in, follow along so you don't miss where this story goes. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. Nobody at Harrow Memorial Hospital remembered the exact day Maggie Doyle stopped speaking up in meetings. It happened so gradually that even she couldn't pinpoint it. Just a slow retreat, conversation by conversation, until silence became her armor. She was 36, originally from a town nobody in Colton, Ohio could find on a map, and she'd worked the overnight shift in the ER for almost 6 years. She showed up early. She left late. She never called in sick, not even the time she dislocated her finger pulling a gurney out of a hallway jam. She wrapped it herself in a supply closet and finished her shift. Nobody asked why she was so steady under pressure. Nobody asked why, during codes, her hands didn't shake while everyone else's did. They just assumed she was naturally calm, the way some people assumed birds were naturally good at flying without ever wondering what kept them in the air. Dr. Preston Vale assumed something else entirely, that she was beneath him. Vale was the kind of surgeon who walked into a room like he already owned the air in it. 51 years old, sharp-jawed, expensive watch. The type of voice that filled hallways whether he meant it to or not. He'd built his reputation over 2 decades at Harrow Memorial, and in his mind, that reputation made him untouchable. "You paged me for what?" he snapped one Tuesday night, storming into Trauma Bay 2 like the floor owed him an apology. "A possible internal bleed? Based on what? Your gut?" Maggie didn't flinch. Based on his pressure dropping 8 points in 4 minutes and rebound tenderness on the right lower quadrant. "That's not your diagnosis to make." "I'm not diagnosing. I'm flagging." Vale exhaled through his nose, the way he always did right before dismissing her. "Get me an ultrasound tech before you start playing doctor." She didn't argue. She just nodded and walked to put in the order herself, because waiting on the on-call tech would cost 10 minutes they didn't have. 12 minutes later, the patient crashed. Vale's face went pale as the monitor screamed and the patient's blood pressure dropped to nothing. The team scrambled. Maggie was already moving, calling for blood products, calling for the on-call surgeon, doing in seconds what should have taken the room 30. They saved him, barely. Afterward, in the hallway, Vale didn't thank her. He turned to the nursing director, a sharp-featured woman named Carla Whitfield, and said quietly, "She needs to be reminded of her role here." Carla's eyes flicked toward Maggie, who was washing blood off her hands at the sink, pretending not to hear. "I'll handle it," Carla said. That was the moment the slow erosion sped up. Over the following weeks, small things started happening. Maggie's shift requests got denied without explanation. Her name disappeared from the trauma rotation she'd been on for years. She'd walk into the break room and conversations would stop, not out of respect, but out of the kind of awkward silence reserved for someone people had already decided to push out. She wasn't stupid. She knew what was happening. She just didn't know why anyone bothered, since she'd never once raised her voice, never gone over anyone's head, never done anything except occasionally be right when someone more senior was wrong. That, apparently, was unforgivable. "You've been distant," her coworker Renee said one night, leaning against the supply cart while Maggie restocked gauze. Renee was one of the few people who still talked to her like a person instead of a problem. "I'm not distant. I'm tired." "That's not the same thing and you know it." Renee studied her face. "Vale's been saying things. About you not respecting the chain of command." Maggie's jaw tightened. "I followed the chain of command. I just also flagged a deteriorating patient because that's literally my job." "I know. I believe you." Renee hesitated. "Just be careful. Carla's been asking people about you, like asking weird questions. Did you go to nursing school where you said you did? Did you really work in the military like your resume says?" Something cold moved through Maggie's chest. Why would she be asking that? Renee shrugged, uneasy. I don't know. But it didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like she was building a file. Maggie didn't say what she was thinking, which was that she knew exactly what kind of file Carla was building because she'd seen people build files before. Just not in hospitals. In places far uglier than this one, where the stakes weren't a job but a life. And the people building the files wanted someone gone before they could embarrass them. She didn't talk about her past, not because it was some closely guarded secret meant to be revealed dramatically, but because nobody had ever asked the right questions. And she'd learned a long time ago that talking about it only invited more questions she didn't want to answer. 6 years of combat medic work didn't exactly come up in casual conversation about weekend plans. The end came on a Thursday, fittingly anticlimactic for something that would later upend an entire hospital. A 16-year-old boy came in after a car accident, conscious, talking, vitals stable enough that the attending physician, not Vale, a younger doctor named Reyes, cleared him for observation and sent him to a regular floor instead of the ICU. Maggie looked at the kid's chart, looked at his face, and felt that same cold certainty she always got right before something went wrong. His abdomen's rigid, she told Reyes quietly, and he's guarding on the left side even though the report says no injury there. His scans were clean. Scans miss things, especially early bleeds. Reyes hesitated, clearly torn, clearly young enough to still be intimidated by overriding an order that had already gone up the chain. I'll mention it to Dr. Vale. She should have let it go right there. She didn't. She went and found Vale herself, found him in his office reviewing something on his laptop, looking irritated before she even opened her mouth. I think the boy in 14 needs another scan, she said. I think there's a splenic injury they missed. Vale didn't even look up. Reyes cleared him. Reyes is wrong. That got his attention. He turned, slow, the kind of slow that was meant to intimidate. Excuse me? I'm telling you there's a problem. You can either listen, or you can find out I was right the same way you always do. The room went silent in a way that felt physical. You don't get to talk to me like that, Vale said, voice low and dangerous. You're a nurse. You don't override a physician's clinical judgment because you have a hunch. It's not a hunch. It's insubordination. He stood up, jaw tight. And frankly, I'm done pretending this is the first time. You've undermined me in front of staff for months. I want her removed from my rotation, he said to Carla, who had appeared in the doorway as if summoned. Today. Dr. Vale, the patient is fine, Vale snapped. Get her out of my department. 40 minutes later, the 16-year-old's blood pressure crashed. A scan, finally ordered, far too late for comfort, revealed a ruptured spleen, internal bleeding that had been quietly filling his abdomen for over an hour, while everyone argued about hierarchy instead of treating him. He survived. Barely, and only because the on-call surgeon got him into the OR with almost no time to spare. Maggie wasn't even allowed back into the building to find out. By the time she cleared out her locker that evening, escorted by hospital security like she was dangerous instead of just inconvenient, the official write-up already existed. Insubordination. Disregard for established protocol. Pattern of undermining medical authority. Nobody wrote down that she'd been right. Nobody ever does. 3 weeks of unemployment did something strange to Maggie. She'd expected anger. She'd expected grief over the job, the routine, the identity she'd built around being useful in a crisis. Instead, she felt mostly numb, scrolling job boards in her small rented house outside Colton, drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, listening to the quiet that used to terrify her back when she'd first come home from her last deployment. She didn't talk about that time much. 6 years as an Army combat medic, 2 deployments, the kind of work that taught her how to keep someone breathing with 2 fingers and a prayer she didn't believe in, the kind of work that left her hands steady in chaos because she'd learned chaos didn't care how steady you were. And the only thing that mattered was doing the job anyway. She'd left the service quietly, no fanfare, just a transition into civilian nursing that she thought would be simpler, lower stakes, safer. She hadn't expected the politics to be worse than the war. Her phone buzzed. A text from Renee. They're saying you lied on your resume about the military thing. Carla's telling people you probably never even deployed, that you just say it to seem more credible. Maggie read it twice, feeling something shift in her chest, something that had been quiet for a long time starting to stir. She didn't respond. There wasn't a point. People who wanted to believe something usually found a way to believe it regardless of facts, and she was too tired to fight a battle that small. She had no idea a battle far bigger than that was about to walk straight into her life and drag every ugly truth out into the open. The explosion happened on a Tuesday morning at 9:42 a.m., though nobody would know the exact time until investigators pieced it together days later. Colton sat 15 miles from the Halvern Chemical Processing Plant, a sprawling industrial complex that employed nearly 400 people and supplied materials to half the manufacturing companies in the region. Nobody in town thought much about it, the way nobody thinks much about infrastructure, until it fails catastrophically. A pressure valve failure in tank cluster 4 triggered a chain reaction that ruptured two adjacent storage tanks within 90 seconds of each other. The resulting explosion tore through the plant's east wing, collapsing a two-story structural section onto the floor below, trapping workers beneath twisted steel, concrete, and burning chemical runoff that made every rescue effort exponentially more dangerous. The blast was visible from 12 miles away, windows shattered in 3 nearby buildings. The shockwave knocked a delivery truck onto its side on the access road. By 9:58 a.m., every emergency scanner in the county was screaming. Harrow Memorial's emergency department went from quiet morning shift to full disaster protocol in under 4 minutes. Dr. Vale, as senior trauma surgeon, was activated as incident command for the hospital's response, a role that came with authority he'd always wanted, an experience he didn't actually have. "I need triage teams at the ambulance bay in 5 minutes," Vale barked into the hospital's emergency line, sounding far more confident than the chaos warranted. "Reyes, you're with me. Whitfield, get me a casualty count from the field." Carla, to her credit, was already working the phones, trying to get information from a scene that hadn't yet stabilized enough to give anyone reliable numbers. "They're saying possibly 30 to 50 injured," she reported, voice tight. "Maybe more. Structural collapse on top of chemical exposure. Fire departments requesting hazmat support." "How many fatalities?" "Unknown. They can't get equipment in yet. The wreckage is unstable." Vale ran a hand through his hair, the first crack in his composure showing. He'd handled trauma cases before. He'd never handled this. Out at the plant, the scene was worse than any radio report could capture. Workers screamed beneath collapsed sections of the east wing, some trapped by debris, some trapped by their own injuries, unable to crawl away from spreading chemical fires. Local fire crews arrived first, overwhelmed almost immediately by the scale of it. Too few hands, too much wreckage, too many competing emergencies happening in the same 40 acres of disaster. A volunteer firefighter named Tom Ashby, 26 years old and barely a year into the job, found himself staring at a collapsed section with at least 4 workers visibly trapped beneath it. No idea where to start. No idea what was structurally safe to move and what would bring the entire section down on top of them. "We need engineering support," his captain was shouting into a radio that kept cutting out. "We need somebody who knows what the hell they're doing with this kind of collapse." Nobody available knew. The closest urban search and rescue team was 90 minutes out. They didn't have 90 minutes. Maggie heard about the explosion the same way most of Colton did. A frantic text from Renee, followed by sirens she could hear even from her house, followed by local news coverage showing smoke rising from the direction of the plant in a column thick enough to blot out part of the sky. She watched for exactly 4 minutes before something in her changed. It wasn't a decision, not really. It was more like muscle memory taking over before her conscious mind caught up. The same instinct that used to get her moving toward gunfire instead of away from it, because somewhere underneath the fear was always a calculation. People need help, and I know how to give it. She grabbed her old field kit from the closet, the one she still kept stocked out of habit, even though she told herself she'd never need it again, and drove toward the smoke instead of away from it. The plant's outer perimeter looked like a war zone, not metaphorically, but literally, in ways that made her chest tighten with recognition. Twisted metal. Smoke. The acrid smell of burning chemicals layered over the metallic scent of blood. Emergency vehicles scattered without coordination, people shouting instructions that contradicted each other. A police officer stopped her at the perimeter line. "Ma'am, you can't be here. This is an active... I'm a trauma nurse, combat medic, 6 years Army. You need hands." The officer hesitated, clearly unsure what to do with that. clearly aware that the chaos behind him was outpacing every protocol he'd been trained for. "We need everyone," he finally said, waving her through. She moved into the scene like she'd never left the service, scanning, assessing, triaging within seconds. Who could wait? Who couldn't? Who needed immediate intervention versus who needed to simply be moved to safety and monitored? She found Tom Ashby first, the young firefighter standing frozen in front of the collapsed section, radio crackling uselessly in his hand. "You in charge here?" she asked. No, not really. My captain's 200 yards that way dealing with a fire suppression issue. He gestured helplessly at the wreckage. 4 people trapped. Maybe more. I don't know what's safe to move." Maggie studied the collapse for 3 seconds, the way she used to study compromised structures back overseas, looking for load points, looking for what would hold and what wouldn't. "That beam," she said, pointing. "If you move that without support, the whole section drops 8 inches and crushes whoever's underneath. You need a secondary support point before anyone touches it." Ashby stared at her. "How do you—" "Later. Right now I need you to find me anything rigid, pipe, beam, anything, to wedge under that support point before we move a single piece of debris. And I need someone checking vitals on whoever's conscious under there. Because triage doesn't stop just because the rescue is complicated." For the first time since the explosion, Ashby felt something other than panic. He felt direction. "Yes, ma'am." Within 20 minutes, Maggie had assembled something resembling order out of pure chaos. Not through authority anyone had given her, but through the simple fact that she was the only person on scene who seemed to know exactly what to do. And people in crisis gravitate toward competence the way water finds the lowest point. She moved between casualties with brutal efficiency, performing field assessments that would have taken paramedics twice as long, identifying internal injuries through nothing but pressure points and breathing patterns, making calls about who needed immediate transport versus who could be stabilized on scene. "This one's got a tension pneumothorax," she said, kneeling beside a worker who'd been pulled from a partially collapsed section, his breathing rapid and shallow, his neck veins distended in a way that made her stomach tighten. "I need a 14-gauge needle. Now." A paramedic, a heavy-set man named Diaz, who'd been on the job 11 years, looked at her like she'd materialized out of nowhere. "Who are you?" "Someone who's done this before. Needle. Now, or he doesn't make it to transport." He handed it over without further argument, watching as she performed a needle decompression with the same casual precisions most people reserve for tying their shoes. The worker's breathing eased almost immediately. "Jesus," Diaz muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry, just where the hell did you learn that?" Different conversation, different day. She was already moving to the next casualty. Get him on a backboard, start O2 and tell transport he's priority 1. By the time the first wave of additional emergency units arrived 20 minutes later, Maggie had personally stabilized 6 critical patients and directed the extraction sequence for the collapsed section, all without anyone in an official capacity telling her she could. Nobody questioned it. Nobody had time to. Back at Harrow Memorial, Dr. Vale was drowning, though he would never have used that word out loud. The first wave of casualties had overwhelmed the ER faster than anyone anticipated, and his command decisions, made with the confidence of a man who'd never actually run a mass casualty event, were starting to fall apart under pressure. "We need to reroute the burn patients to County General. They don't have capacity for what's coming," Reyes said, trying to keep his voice level. "County General doesn't have the staff for this either," Vale snapped. "We handle it here." "We don't have the beds here. Then we make beds. Clear out anything non-critical." Carla appeared, face pale, holding her phone like it had just delivered bad news. "Dr. Vale, we have a problem." "I'm aware we have several." "No, this is different." She turned her phone toward him, showing a local news live stream from the plant, a shaky cell phone quality feed showing a chaotic rescue scene. "Someone's coordinating the field triage out there, performing procedures. The fire captain's crediting her with saving at least 6 lives already." Vale glanced at the screen, distracted, annoyed by the interruption. "Good. Whoever it is, tell them to keep doing it." "Dr. Vale." Carla's voice had an edge to it now. "It's Maggie." The room went quiet. Vale's expression shifted through several stages: confusion, disbelief, something that looked uncomfortably close to dread. "That's not possible," he said. "She's a nurse. A fired nurse. The fire captain's calling her a combat medic on the broadcast. Says she performed a field decompression. Says she's running triage out there like she's done it 100 times. Vale stared at the screen, at the grainy footage of a woman directing rescue workers with the kind of calm authority he'd spent his entire career trying to project and had never quite managed under real pressure. He recognized her posture before he consciously processed it was her. The same stillness she'd had in every argument they'd ever had. The stillness he'd mistaken for insolence instead of what it actually was. The stillness of someone who'd already survived worse than whatever was happening in front of her. "This is a mistake," he said quietly, though it wasn't clear who he was trying to convince. Outside, sirens kept screaming and the chemical fire kept burning, and the day was about to get exponentially worse before anyone had time to process what it meant that the woman they'd thrown away was the only person currently keeping it from becoming a massacre. The military response arrived at 11:20 a.m., summoned not by the hospital, not by local government, but by federal protocol triggered automatically once the chemical exposure risk at Halvern plant was classified as a potential hazmat-level incident requiring specialized containment. 4 black SUVs rolled through the perimeter checkpoint, and the energy on scene shifted immediately. Not panic, but a kind of charged attention, the recognition that something more serious had just entered the picture. A team of 6 operators stepped out, led by a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, whose presence alone made local responders straighten up without being told to. Major Holt Bracewell, attached to a specialized hazmat response unit, had handled exactly the kind of structural chemical disaster currently unfolding in front of him. He scanned the scene with practiced efficiency, immediately clocking the field triage area, immediately noticing the unusual competence of whoever was running it. Then he saw her face, and everything in his expression changed. "No," he said quietly, almost to himself. "No way." He crossed the distance fast, ignoring the local fire captain trying to brief him, ignoring everything except the woman crouched over a patient, hands moving with the same precision he remembered from a hospital tent 8,000 miles away. "Doyle?" Maggie looked up, and for one full second the chaos around her seemed to disappear entirely. "Bracewell?" Her voice cracked slightly, the first real emotion she'd shown all day. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Federal Response Unit. We got called in for hazmat containment." He stared at her like she was something impossible, something he'd genuinely never expected to see again outside of memory. "What I want to know is what the hell you're doing running field triage with no gear, no backup, and apparently no official authorization." Somebody had to. He almost laughed, except nothing about the moment was funny. "Of course you did." Then his expression sharpened, all business again. "Sit rep. Now. What am I walking into?" She gave it to him fast, efficient, the same shorthand they'd used overseas, casualty counts, structural hazards, which sections were stable, which weren't, which patients needed immediate extraction versus which could wait. Bracewell listened, nodding, occasionally glancing toward the wreckage she was describing with an accuracy that made it clear she'd already mapped the entire disaster zone in her head. "You're sure about the load points on the east collapse?" "I'm sure." "Good enough for me." He turned to his team. "She's giving the structural assessment. Treat it as gospel." One of his operators, a younger soldier who clearly didn't recognize her, frowned. "Sir, with respect, who is she?" Bracewell's answer carried across the immediate area, loud enough that several nearby first responders heard it, loud enough that it would later be repeated in every news report covering the disaster. "She's the medic who kept 3 of my men alive after an IED took out half our convoy in Kandahar. If she says the load points are stable, the load points are stable." The young soldier's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to awe. Word moved fast through the scene after that, the way it always does in moments of crisis. Whispers passing between rescue workers, paramedics glancing toward Maggie with new understanding, the slow dawning realization rippling outward that the woman directing triage wasn't some lucky civilian who happened to know first aid. She was something else entirely. Back at Harrow Memorial, the news arrived in pieces, each one more unsettling than the last. Reyes found Vale in the staff lounge, staring at his phone, scrolling through the same local news feed that was now showing Maggie directly. No longer a blurry figure in the background, but the clear focal point of the broadcast, performing triage with a federal officer at her side, treating her like the ranking authority on scene. Sir, Reyes said carefully, you should see this. I've seen it. There's more. Reyes hesitated. The news is saying the military commander on scene specifically credited her with combat medical service. Multiple deployments. They're saying she saved his entire unit overseas. Vale's jaw tightened, his face the particular shade of pale that came from realizing a problem was bigger than initially assessed. That doesn't change anything about her conduct here, doesn't it? The question hung in the air, sharper than Reyes probably intended. Vale looked at him, something cold passing between them. Get back to your patients, Dr. Reyes. Reyes left, but the doubt he'd planted didn't. Carla appeared a moment later, looking like someone who'd just watched her entire professional strategy collapse in real time. Preston, I think we need to talk about how we handle this when There's no if, Vale snapped. She's still the nurse we terminated for insubordination. Whatever she did out there doesn't erase that. It might erase it in everyone else's eyes. Vale didn't answer, because he didn't have one, and because some small buried part of him already understood that the version of events he'd built, the narrative where Maggie Doyle was simply a difficult employee who didn't know her place, was about to collide head-on with a truth far bigger and far more dangerous than he was prepared for. Outside, the chemical fires were finally coming under control. Inside the wreckage, the last trapped workers were being extracted, every single one of them alive. Every single one of them owing that fact to triage decisions made by a woman in faded scrubs that this hospital had thrown away 3 weeks earlier. And somewhere in the back of his mind, underneath the denial he was still clinging to, Preston Vale understood with a sick, sinking certainty that whatever was coming next, he wasn't going to like it. He had no idea it was about to get so much worse, because the federal incident report being filed that afternoon wouldn't just document a disaster response. It would document exactly who had been right, who had been wrong, and exactly how far Harrow Memorial had gone to bury the truth. The federal incident report being filed that afternoon wouldn't just document a disaster response. It would document exactly who had been right, who had been wrong, and exactly how far Harrow Memorial had gone to bury the truth. Major Bracewell pulled a small recorder from his jacket pocket as the last extraction team cleared the east collapse. His voice clipped and official in a way that hadn't been present minutes earlier when he'd been laughing with Maggie about something neither of them would repeat to anyone else. Incident command log, 1432 hours. All trapped personnel extracted, 0 fatalities at primary collapse site. Structural assessment and triage prioritization performed by civilian medical personnel, Margaret Doyle, former U.S. Army combat medic, Bravo Company, prior to federal unit arrival. He paused, glancing at her. You want your rank in this? I don't have a rank anymore, Holt. I got out. Doesn't matter. What you did out here gets documented either way. He clicked off the recorder and studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that came from genuine concern rather than curiosity. You look thinner than I remember. Civilian life will do that. Civilian life's supposed to be easier. She let out a short, humorless laugh, wiping chemical grit from her hands with a rag someone had handed her 20 minutes ago. Yeah, somebody forgot to tell my old hospital that. Bracewell's eyebrows lifted slightly, picking up on something underneath the joke. Old hospital, past tense. They let me go 3 weeks ago. For what? Insubordination. She said the word flatly, without inflection. The way people say things they've repeated to themselves so many times, the sting has worn down to something smoother and colder. Apparently, flagging a deteriorating patient counts as undermining a doctor's authority if the doctor in question doesn't like being wrong. Something tightened in Bracewell's jaw, a flicker of the same protective anger she remembered from the field, the look he used to get right before he chewed out anyone who put his people at unnecessary risk. You saved my life, he said quietly. You saved Danvers. You saved Okafor. You kept Reyes breathing for 40 minutes with a chest tube made out of a ballpoint pen casing until the medevac got there. And some hospital fired you for flagging a patient? It's a different war, Holt. Different rules. Apparently worse ones. She didn't answer that, mostly because she agreed with him and didn't want to say so out loud. Didn't want to give the bitterness any more room to breathe than it already had. A young paramedic named Diaz approached cautiously, the same one who'd questioned her authority less than an hour earlier and now looked at her like she'd grown a second head. Ma'am, Ms. Doyle, county's asking if you can ride with the next transport wave. Said you've got better trauma instincts than half their senior staff. Bracewell smirked. See? Somebody out here's got sense. I'm not licensed to practice civilian medicine right now, Maggie said carefully. I can advise. I can't treat. They don't care about licensing today, Diaz said. They care about people not dying. She looked toward the line of ambulances, toward the wounded still being loaded, and felt the old pull again, the same gravitational force that had dragged her out of her house and into this disaster zone in the first place. I'll ride with the critical transports, she said, but someone needs to coordinate the secondary triage zone once Major Bracewell's team takes over containment. On it, Diaz said, already moving. Bracewell watched her go, something complicated passing across his weathered face. He'd known a lot of soldiers who came home and disappeared into versions of themselves nobody recognized. He hadn't expected Maggie to be one of them, hadn't expected the quiet competence she'd always carried to curdle into something this exhausted, this beaten down by a system that should have recognized her value instead of discarding it. He pulled out his phone and made a call he hadn't planned on making an hour earlier. The hospital's emergency department had reached the particular kind of controlled panic that exists in the space between catastrophe and collapse. Too many patients, not enough hands, every decision compounding into the next decision faster than anyone could process it cleanly. Dr. Vale stood at the center of it, trying to project the calm authority that had defined his entire career, failing in increments small enough that only the most observant staff noticed. We need another surgical suite freed up, Reyes said, jogging to catch him between patients. OR2's backed up with the crush injury from the warehouse collapse. Then push OR3's elective case. There is no elective case in OR3, sir. It's already running a splenectomy. Vale stopped walking, jaw flexing. Then improvise something. I don't care what. We need capacity. Reyes hesitated, the kind of hesitation that came from years of training telling him to defer to seniority, colliding with the growing, undeniable awareness that the man giving orders was improvising far more than he was leading. Sir, with respect, maybe we should request mutual aid from county. I already told Whitfield no on that. Maybe it's time to reconsider. Vale turned, something sharp flashing across his features. Are you questioning my incident command, Dr. Reyes? The younger doctor's mouth tightened. For one suspended moment, it looked like he might actually answer honestly. Instead, he swallowed it down, the same way every junior staff member at Harrow Memorial had learned to swallow disagreement with Preston Vale. No, sir. Good, then get back to your patients. Reyes walked away, and Vale stood alone for a moment amid the chaos, breathing hard, feeling something he refused to name as panic settling into his chest like a stone. He glanced at his phone, still sitting on the supply cart where he'd left it, still showing the paused live stream feed of Maggie Doyle directing triage with a federal officer treating her recommendations as absolute fact. He picked it up and deleted the tab, as if that would erase what he'd seen. It didn't. What? By early afternoon, the ambulance bay at Harrow Memorial had become a steady river of incoming trauma, each wave slightly less chaotic than the last as the Disaster Zone's organization, Maggie's organization, though almost no one inside the hospital walls had yet connected that fact, began paying dividends in patient outcomes. The crush injuries arrived stable instead of crashing en route. The chemical exposure cases arrived with accurate triage tags instead of guesswork. The internal bleeds arrived flagged with specific notes about probable injury sites instead of vague descriptions that wasted precious diagnostic time. Whoever's running triage out there is incredible, one of the transport paramedics told Carla as they wheeled in another patient. She called this guy's pelvic fracture before we even got him fully extracted. Saved us 10 minutes on imaging. She? Carla asked, though she already suspected the answer, already felt it settling into her stomach like something inevitable. Yeah, older nurse type, tiny thing, doesn't look like much until she starts talking. Federal hazmat commanders treating her like she outranks him. Carla didn't respond, just nodded and walked away faster than the conversation warranted, finding Vale near the trauma bay doors and pulling him aside with a grip on his arm that was more forceful than professional decorum usually allowed. Preston, we have a serious problem. I'm aware. No, you're not. Not the full scope of it. She lowered her voice, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. The transport teams are saying Maggie's patient assessments are catching things our own ER docs are missing. They're saying it openly, in front of other staff. Vale's expression hardened into something brittle. That's anecdotal. It's not anecdotal when 6 different transport teams independently say the same thing. Carla's voice carried an edge of genuine fear now. The fear of someone who could see a carefully constructed narrative starting to crack under pressure it was never built to withstand. If even half of what they're saying is true, and it comes out that we fired her 3 weeks before she single-handedly organized triage for a mass casualty event that this hospital was completely unprepared for, it won't come out. It's already coming out, Preston. It's on the news. He didn't have an answer for that. He just stared at her, jaw working, the first real cracks of fear showing through the confident mask he'd worn for 20 years. We need to get ahead of this, Carla continued. Control the narrative before someone else controls it for us. What did you have in mind? She hesitated, and in that hesitation was the answer they both already knew, but neither wanted to say out loud first. That the easiest way to control a narrative about an inconvenient truth was to discredit the person telling it. We remind people why she was terminated, Carla said carefully. Insubordination, a documented pattern of undermining clinical authority. If this attention turns into some kind of public moment for her, we need the record to already show she's not stable, not reliable. Vale's eyes narrowed slightly, something cold and calculating moving behind them. That's not entirely untrue. It doesn't need to be entirely true. It just needs to be plausible enough to muddy things. Neither of them said the quiet part out loud. That the boy in room 14, the one whose ruptured spleen had nearly killed him because Vale ignored Maggie's warning, was still recovering 2 floors above them, his medical chart sitting in records like a landmine waiting for the wrong person to step on it. Maggie rode in the back of the 3rd ambulance transport with a worker named Desmond Calloway, a 44-year-old maintenance technician who'd been pulled from beneath a collapsed catwalk with crush injuries to both legs and a chest wall contusion that was making every breath sound wet and dangerous. "Stay with me, Desmond. Eyes on me." "Feels like," he gasped, voice fading. "Feels like I'm drowning." "You're not drowning. Your lungs bruised, and that's making it feel that way. But you're getting enough air, I promise you that." She kept her voice level, steady. The exact tone she'd learned years ago calmed patients faster than any medication could. "Tell me about your kids. You got kids?" 2. Girls. His breath hitched. 9 and 12. "What are their names?" "Reagan and..." He coughed, wincing. "Reagan and Maisie. Reagan and Maisie are going to see their dad tonight. You understand me? You just need to keep breathing the way you're breathing right now. In through your nose, slow, like I'm doing." She demonstrated, and he followed, his oxygen saturation ticking up 2 points on the monitor, small but meaningful progress in a situation that could have gone sideways fast. The paramedic riding with them, a quiet woman named Britt, watched the exchange with something between admiration and curiosity. "You've done this before, like a lot. Long time ago. Doesn't seem that long ago the way you're working." Maggie didn't answer, focused on Desmond's vitals, on the rhythm of his breathing, on the dozens of small calculations running constantly beneath the surface of her attention that most people never notice because they happen too fast and too quietly to register as anything except instinct. They arrived at Harrow Memorial 11 minutes later. The trauma team met them at the bay doors, and for the first time all day, Maggie found herself walking back into the building that had fired her 3 weeks earlier, escorted not by security this time, but by a federal incident report and a chest-injured patient whose stability was the direct result of decisions she'd made in the back of a moving ambulance. The reception she got wasn't warm. It wasn't hostile either. It was something more uncomfortable than both, a kind of stunned, uncertain silence. The silence of people who didn't know how to process the fact that the person they'd been told was unstable and insubordinate had just delivered a critical patient with a flawless field report. Renee was working triage intake. Her eyes went wide when she saw Maggie come through the doors. Maggie, tension pneumo risk on the right side, chest wall contusion, crush injuries bilateral lower extremities, vitals stable, but trending toward respiratory compromise, Maggie said, handing off without breaking stride. The report automatic, the kind of fluency that came from years of doing exactly this under far worse conditions. He needs imaging fast. I don't like the sound of that lung. The trauma team absorbed the handoff and moved, and for one suspended second, Renee just stared at her friend like she was looking at someone she'd never fully known, despite working beside her for 6 years. What happened to you out there? Nothing happened to me. I just did what I used to do. Maggie's voice carried an exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. Before all this, before Renee could ask what this meant, Carla appeared at the end of the hallway, flanked by 2 security staff, her expression carefully neutral in the way that only made her intentions more obvious. Maggie. Carla's voice was clipped, professional, deliberately distant. You can't be in this building. You understand that, right? You were terminated. The hallway around them went quiet in the specific way that happens when people pretend not to listen while listening intently. I brought in a critical patient from the disaster site, Maggie said evenly. I wasn't planning to stay. Then I'll need you to leave. Now. Maggie studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing across her face. She'd expected hostility eventually. She just hadn't expected it this fast, this transparent. You're worried, Maggie said quietly. Not about hospital policy, about what happens if people start asking why a combat medic with 6 years of field experience got fired for catching a deteriorating patient that your senior surgeon dismissed. Carla's expression flickered, just barely, just enough to confirm she'd hit the target dead center. That's not what this is about, isn't it? Security will escort you out. Maggie didn't fight it. She simply turned and walked, calm in a way that unsettled the security staff more than any resistance would have, because resistance was something they were trained to handle and quiet certainty was not. But before she reached the doors, a voice stopped her. Major Bracewell, who'd followed the transport into the building and had clearly heard every word of the exchange. There a problem here? Carla's face shifted into something more careful, more performative, the kind of expression reserved for dealing with federal officials instead of fired employees. No problem, Major, just hospital policy regarding former staff. Former staff who just helped coordinate triage for a mass casualty event that your hospital was completely unprepared to handle alone. Bracewell's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it, the kind of steel that came from someone used to being obeyed without needing to raise his volume. I've got a federal incident report being filed within the hour that documents exactly that. Might be worth considering how this hospital wants to be positioned in that report before you escort her out the door like she's a problem, instead of the reason a dozen of your incoming patients are stable enough to survive surgery. The hallway went dead silent. Carla's careful composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for the fear underneath to show through. We appreciate Ms. Doyle's assistance during the emergency. That's not in question. Good. Then I'd suggest treating her like someone you appreciate instead of someone you're trying to remove from the premises in front of witnesses. Maggie didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The shift in the room had already happened, the balance tilting in a direction that hadn't existed an hour earlier, and everyone present could feel it, even if no one wanted to name it out loud. She walked out the front doors a few minutes later, unescorted, unbothered, while behind her the hospital's carefully maintained narrative began developing fault lines that no amount of damage control was going to fully repair. But by 6 that evening, the disaster response had stabilized into something resembling controlled aftermath. Fire crews continued working contained sections of the chemical fire. Search teams completed their final sweeps. The official casualty count settled at 41 injured, 0 fatalities, a number that local officials kept repeating with visible relief, a number that wouldn't have existed without the triage decisions made in the first 90 minutes of chaos. Bracewell sat in the back of a federal response vehicle, finishing his incident report on a laptop balanced on his knee, when Maggie climbed in beside him, looking like someone running on fumes and stubbornness rather than actual energy. "You good?" he asked. "I'm upright. That's about all I can promise right now." He studied her for a moment, something gentler in his expression than the hardened command presence he'd shown back at the hospital. "You want to tell me what actually happened with that termination? Because I've known you a long time, Doyle, and insubordination has never once been a real description of anything you've done." She let out a slow breath, rubbing her eyes with the back of her wrist. "I flagged a deteriorating patient. The attending surgeon ignored it because he didn't like being told he was wrong by a nurse. Patient crashed exactly the way I said he would. Instead of acknowledging it, the surgeon got me fired for undermining his authority. Bracewell's expression darkened. That's not insubordination. That's malpractice covering its own tracks. Try telling the hospital that. I plan to, in writing. He turned his laptop toward her slightly, showing the draft incident report on screen. This document's going to multiple agencies, Doyle. State Emergency Management, Federal Hazmat Oversight, probably the County Health Department given the scale of casualties. Your name's all over it, in the context of saving lives that would have otherwise been lost to delayed triage. He paused. You understand what that means for the hospital that fired you 3 weeks before this happened? I understand it's going to make some people very uncomfortable. It's going to make some people's careers very short. She didn't respond to that, mostly because some part of her still couldn't quite process the idea that the truth might actually matter this time, that the years of being quietly dismissed and overlooked might finally collide with consequences for the people doing the dismissing. There's something else, Bracewell said carefully, closing the laptop. Local news has been asking the Incident Command Office for an interview, specifically about the civilian medic who organized field triage. They've got footage. They've got witness statements from at least a dozen first responders. This isn't staying small, Doyle, whether you want it to or not. I don't want any of this. I know. That's exactly why it's going to happen the right way instead of the wrong way. He met her eyes, steady. You spent 6 years making sure my people survived things they shouldn't have survived. Let me make sure this hospital doesn't get to bury what you did today the same way they buried what you did before. She didn't answer immediately. Outside the vehicle, emergency lights still flashed against smoke-darkened sky, and somewhere behind her, Harrow Memorial Hospital sat full of patients who were alive because of decisions made by a woman they'd thrown away. Okay, she finally said, quiet but certain. Do it right. Tut. The first crack in Harrow Memorial's official narrative appeared less than 12 hours later, in the form of a local news segment that aired during the 6 o'clock broadcast and immediately began circulating online with a speed that caught hospital administration completely off guard. The footage was raw, unpolished, shot on a reporter's phone during the chaos of the disaster response. But it was unmistakable. Maggie directing extraction teams. Maggie performing a needle decompression with calm precision. Major Bracewell's voice, captured clearly, declaring to his team that she was the medic who'd saved his men in Kandahar. The segment ended with a brief interview with Tom Ashby, the young firefighter, his voice still carrying traces of the awe he'd felt that morning. I didn't know what to do, he told the camera. 4 people trapped, unstable wreckage. No idea how to proceed safely. She walked up, assessed the whole structure in like 10 seconds, told us exactly what would hold and what wouldn't. Everybody we pulled out of that collapse is alive because of her. The anchor's follow-up question hung heavy in the air. And we understand she was recently let go from her nursing position at Harrow Memorial? Ashby's expression shifted, confusion replacing certainty. Wait, she got fired? From a hospital? Why the hell would anyone fire someone like that? The clip ended there, the question left deliberately unanswered, hanging like an accusation over the entire segment. By morning, it had been shared thousands of times. Local message boards filled with speculation, comments asking the same question Ashby had asked on camera, asking it louder, asking it with growing anger directed squarely at a hospital that suddenly found itself fielding calls from local reporters instead of issuing them. Vale arrived at the hospital before sunrise, having barely slept, having watched the segment more times than he wanted to admit, each viewing tightening the knot of dread in his stomach. Carla met him in the parking lot, looking similarly hollowed out, holding her phone like it had personally betrayed her. It's everywhere, she said without preamble. The hospital's PR office has fielded 6 media requests since 5 a.m. They want comment on why we terminated a combat medic 3 weeks before a mass casualty event she single-handedly helped manage. Tell them it's a personnel matter, confidential. That's not going to satisfy anyone, Preston. People want answers, and the longer we stay silent, the more it looks like we're hiding something. We are hiding something. The admission slipped out before he could stop it, and the moment it did, both of them understood the conversation had shifted into territory neither wanted to occupy. Carla's voice dropped lower. The boy in room 14. His family hasn't filed anything yet. But if this story keeps growing, If reporters start digging into why Maggie was actually terminated instead of accepting the official write-up at face value, they won't find anything. The write-up's clean. The write-up's fabricated, Preston, and you know it. If someone pulls the actual timeline, if someone talks to Reyes about what really happened that day, Reyes won't talk. Are you sure about that? Carla's eyes were sharp now, frightened in a way that made her dangerous rather than sympathetic. Because I'm not sure of anything anymore. Not after watching transport teams praise her competence in front of half our staff. Not after watching a federal officer threaten to put this hospital's name in an incident report for trying to remove her from the building. Vale's jaw tightened. What do you want me to do, Carla? Admit I was wrong? Publicly? I want you to understand that this isn't going away. And the longer we pretend it will, the worse it's going to get when it doesn't. He didn't answer, because some buried, honest part of him already knew she was right, and that part of him terrified him more than anything that had happened during the disaster itself. The boy's name was Caleb Renner. 16 years old, recovering on the 3rd floor from emergency splenectomy surgery, the kind of injury that should never have escalated as far as it had if anyone had simply listened to the nurse who'd flagged it hours before his crash. His mother, Diane Renner, had spent 3 sleepless weeks watching her son recover, grateful he'd survived, increasingly furious as small details kept surfacing that didn't match the explanation the hospital had originally given her. She'd been told it was an unforeseen complication, a rare presentation that the imaging had missed. Nothing anyone could have predicted. Then her sister sent her the news clip about the disaster at Halvern plant, about the combat medic nurse who'd organized triage with terrifying competence, about the hospital that had fired her weeks earlier. And Diane Renner recognized the name immediately because she'd overheard a conversation in the hallway outside Caleb's room 3 weeks ago. A young doctor named Reyes talking quietly to another nurse, saying something about how Maggie called it hours before it happened, and they fired her for it anyway. She'd filed it away at the time, too consumed with worry about her son to process what it meant. Now, watching the news footage, watching a federal officer praise a woman this hospital had discarded like garbage, the implications crystallized into something sharp and undeniable. She called the local news station that had run the original segment. The reporter who answered, a persistent woman named Joelle Marsh, who'd been covering the disaster story since the explosion, listened to Diane's account with growing intensity, asking careful, pointed questions, recognizing immediately that she'd stumbled onto something far bigger than a feel-good rescue story. "You're telling me," Joelle said slowly, "that this same nurse, Maggie Doyle, flagged your son's condition hours before he crashed, and the hospital fired her for it instead of addressing the actual medical error?" "I'm telling you, I overheard a doctor say exactly that. I don't have proof, but I know what I heard." "Would you be willing to go on record?" Diane hesitated, glancing toward her son's hospital room, toward the recovery that had cost him weeks of pain and nearly cost him everything. "My son is still a patient there. I don't want retaliation affecting his care." "I understand. But if what you're describing is true, there might be other families who experience something similar. And right now, this hospital is benefiting from a public narrative that completely contradicts what actually happened." Diane was quiet for a long moment, weighing fear against fury, weighing caution against the deep, simmering anger she'd been carrying since the moment she learned how close she'd come to losing her son to a mistake that someone had tried to warn the hospital about. "Let me think about it," she finally said. But the seed had already been planted, and Joelle Marsh was not the kind of reporter who let a story like this fade quietly once she'd caught the scent of it. Maggie spent the day after the disaster doing nothing in particular, which felt strange after the intensity of the previous 24 hours. Sitting in her small kitchen, drinking coffee that actually stayed warm this time, watching local news coverage with a detachment that surprised her. She hadn't expected the attention. She hadn't wanted it either. She'd done what she did because people needed help. The same reason she'd done everything in her career, military or civilian, and the sudden public fascination with her felt less like vindication and more like exposure, like something private had been dragged out into daylight without her permission. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail, then answered out of habit. "Ms. Doyle, this is Joelle Marsh. I'm a reporter with... I know who you are. I saw the segment. I appreciate you picking up. I was hoping to talk to you directly about what happened at Halvern plant, and also..." Joelle paused, her tone shifting into something more careful, more deliberate. "About your termination from Harrow Memorial." I've spoken with a family who believes there may be a connection between your dismissal and a medical incident that occurred shortly before. Maggie's stomach tightened. What family? I'm not able to disclose that yet, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to share your side, especially given everything that's come out about your background, your service record. If there's more to this story than insubordination, people deserve to know. Maggie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the day pressing down harder than the physical exhaustion had. She hadn't planned on this. She'd planned on disappearing back into the quiet, anonymous life she'd been living before the explosion, before the cameras, before any of it. But somewhere underneath the exhaustion was something else, something that had been buried for 3 weeks under numbness and disappointment, something that felt dangerously close to hope. There was a patient, she said slowly, a 16-year-old boy. I flagged his symptoms hours before he crashed. I was overruled. I was fired the same day for arguing with the surgeon who ignored me. The silence on the other end of the line felt charged, electric. Would you be willing to talk to me on record about that? Maggie thought about Caleb Renner, about the cold certainty she'd felt looking at his chart, about Vale's voice telling her she didn't get to override clinical judgment because of a hunch. She thought about every patient she'd ever advocated for who'd been ignored because of her title, every warning dismissed because the person delivering it didn't carry the right credentials in the eyes of people who valued hierarchy over outcomes. Yes, she said finally. I'll talk to you. Across town, inside an office at Harrow Memorial that suddenly felt much smaller than it had the day before, Preston Vale's phone buzzed with a message from the hospital's communications director, the subject line alone enough to drain whatever color remained in his face. Local news requesting comment regarding Caleb Renner case and possible connection to Maggie Doyle's termination. Need to discuss before this goes any further. He stared at the screen for a long, frozen moment, the carefully constructed wall around his career beginning to show the first deep, irreversible cracks. And somewhere beneath the fear was a growing, sickening certainty that the version of events he'd spent 3 weeks protecting was about to collapse far faster and far more publicly than he'd ever imagined possible. He stared at the screen for a long, frozen moment, the carefully constructed wall around his career beginning to show the first deep, irreversible cracks, and somewhere beneath the fear was a growing, sickening certainty that the version of events he'd spent 3 weeks protecting was about to collapse far faster and far more publicly than he'd ever imagined possible. He called an emergency meeting before the morning shift change, gathering the people who mattered most into a conference room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old carpet. Carla sat to his right, arms folded tight across her chest like she was holding herself together by force. The hospital's communications director, a clipped, anxious woman named Patricia Orr, sat across from them with a legal pad already half filled with notes she'd made before anyone else arrived. Reyes had been summoned too, though nobody had bothered explaining why, and he sat near the door looking like a man who already sensed the room had been arranged specifically to box him in. We need a unified position before this reporter publishes anything, Patricia said, tapping her pen against the pad without looking up. Right now, the story is a feel-good piece about a former combat medic helping during a disaster. If it shifts into hospital fired a hero and covered up a medical error, that's not a PR problem anymore. That's a liability problem, and it's the kind that follows a hospital for a decade. There was no medical error, Vale said. Patricia looked at him steadily, the way someone looks at a man they've already stopped believing. Was there a deteriorating patient that the attending surgeon dismissed, who then crashed? There was a complication that occurred despite appropriate clinical. Was there a deteriorating patient, Patricia repeated, slower this time, each word landing like a separate accusation, that the attending surgeon dismissed, who then crashed? The silence stretched long enough to answer the question on its own. Carla looked down at the table. Reyes shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under him, loud in a room that had gone otherwise still. Yes, Reyes said quietly from the corner. Every head in the room turned toward him. Dr. Reyes, Vale said, voice carrying a warning edge, this isn't the forum for... You asked me here. Reyes's hands were shaking slightly where they rested on his knees, but his voice held steady, the way it sometimes does when a person finally says something they've been holding in too long. I assume that means you want my account of what happened, since I was the attending of record before you took over Caleb Renner's case. He took a breath. Maggie flagged abdominal rigidity and asymmetric guarding on the left side, even though imaging hadn't shown injury there. I mentioned it to Dr. Vale because I wasn't confident enough in my own judgment to override the scan results on my own. He told her she was wrong. He told her it was insubordination, and he had her removed from the department before anyone reassessed the patient. 40 minutes later, the patient's pressure crashed. We barely got him to the OR in time. If it had been 10 minutes later, I don't think he survives. Carla's face had gone the color of old paper. That's not the version that's documented, Vale said tightly. I know, Reyes said. I signed off on the version that's documented because you told me it would protect the department, and I was a second-year attending who didn't think he had a choice. He looked down at his hands, voice dropping. I've thought about that decision every single day since. I told myself it was a small lie. I told myself nobody would get hurt by it. I was wrong about that too. Patricia set down her pen very slowly, the small gesture somehow louder than if she'd thrown it across the room. Are you telling me there's a falsified incident report in this hospital's records? An actual fabricated document, not just an incomplete one? Nobody answered. The silence answered for them, the way silence always does in rooms full of people who already know exactly how guilty they are. Because if there is, Patricia continued, and a reporter gets even half of what Dr. Reyes just said, we're not managing a PR problem. We're managing a malpractice cover-up, a wrongful termination suit, and potentially a state medical board investigation, all at the same time. All because nobody in this hospital had the courage to say 4 honest sentences 3 weeks ago. Vale's jaw worked, his composure finally, visibly fracturing in a way none of them had seen before. Not during codes, not during difficult families, not during anything in 20 years of practice. I wanted on the record that I made a clinical judgment call based on the information available at the time. The information available, Reyes said, voice sharper now, included a trauma nurse with combat medical experience telling you specifically what was wrong, in specific clinical terms, with specific findings. You didn't make a clinical judgment call. You made a decision about whose voice mattered in that room, and you got it wrong. And instead of admitting it when the patient crashed exactly the way she predicted, you destroyed her career to protect yours. The room went silent in a way that felt almost physical, the kind of silence that exists right before something irreversible happens. Patricia closed her legal pad. Carla didn't move at all. And Vale sat there, surrounded by people who had spent years deferring to him, watching every one of them recalculate in real time exactly how much they were willing to lose by staying loyal to a man who had just been proven, definitively, to have built his authority on someone else's silence. Mom. Joelle Marsh published her story online at 11 that morning, under a headline that spread faster than the hospital's communications team could draft a response. Decorated combat medic fired for flagging patient, then saved dozens. After hospital's own crisis response faltered. The piece was careful, meticulously sourced, the kind of journalism that didn't need sensationalism because the facts did the work on their own. It included the recorded interview with Major Bracewell, his statement about Kandahar repeated nearly word for word. It included Diane Renner's account, given anonymously at first but corroborated independently once Reyes, against hospital counsel's explicit instruction, agreed to confirm the timeline on record, his name attached, his career on the line in a way that made the story impossible to dismiss as hearsay. It included a statement requested from Harrow Memorial that consisted of exactly one sentence. Harrow Memorial Hospital takes all patient safety concerns seriously and is currently reviewing the matter internally. Online, that sentence became a punchline within an hour. Someone screenshotted it next to a photo of Maggie crouched over a patient in the wreckage and captioned it simply, "This is what reviewing internally looks like when it's working." It got shared more than the article itself. By noon, the story had been picked up by 2 regional outlets. By 2, a cable news producer had called Joelle directly, asking about availability for a national segment. By 4, a hashtag people started using had crossed into trending territory statewide, fueled by veterans groups, nursing associations, and ordinary people furious at a story that confirmed something they already suspected about how institutions treated the people who told inconvenient truths. Maggie watched none of it happen in real time. She'd turned her phone off around noon, overwhelmed by the volume of notifications, and had gone to sit in her backyard instead, staring at nothing in particular, trying to process a version of her life that suddenly belonged to strangers who decided what it meant before she'd had a chance to decide for herself. Renee found her there an hour later, having let herself in through the unlocked side gate, looking flushed and slightly out of breath. "You need to turn your phone back on." "I really don't." Maggie. Renee sat down across from her at the small patio table, eyes wide with something between excitement and disbelief. Reyes confirmed everything, on record, with his name on it. The timeline, the chart notes, the fact that Vale fired you the same day he ignored your warning. It's everywhere. People are losing their minds over this. Maggie absorbed that slowly, feeling something complicated move through her chest. Not triumph, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something heavier and more exhausted than relief had any right to feel. "He could lose his license for that," she said, "for admitting it. He already knows. He told me he didn't care anymore." Renee leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Maggie, the hospital board called an emergency session for tomorrow morning. People are saying Vale's license might get suspended pending investigation. Carla, too, for the falsified report. That doesn't undo what happened to Caleb." "No, but it might keep it from happening to the next kid." Renee's voice softened, the excitement draining into something more sincere. "You did that. Not the rescue, well, that too, obviously, but this part. The part where the truth actually came out instead of disappearing the way it usually does, the way it was supposed to." Maggie didn't answer right away. She was thinking about every quiet moment over the past 6 years where she'd swallowed an objection because raising it cost more than staying silent. Every instance where she'd learned that being right didn't matter as much as being convenient to the people above her. "I didn't do anything except refuse to disappear quietly," she finally said. "Sometimes that's the whole fight." The State Nursing Board's emergency notification arrived at Harrow Memorial's administrative office at 4:30 that afternoon, informing the hospital that a formal complaint had been filed regarding the termination of Margaret Doyle, RN, with specific allegations of retaliation against a whistleblower and falsification of personnel and incident records. The letter was 3 pages long, clinical in tone, devastating in implication. Simultaneously, the State Medical Board opened a parallel inquiry into Dr. Preston Vale's conduct regarding patient Caleb Renner, triggered by Reyes's on-record statement and supported by hospital records that, once subpoenaed, would show a timeline impossible to reconcile with the official write-up that had been filed 3 weeks earlier. The hospital's CEO, a measured, silver-haired man named Walter Henning, who had spent most of his tenure successfully avoiding scandal through quiet competence rather than crisis management, called Vale into his office at 5, closing the door with a finality that made the room feel smaller than it was. "Tell me this isn't true," Henning said, not bothering to sit down. "It's not as simple as the reporting makes it sound." "Preston." Henning's voice carried the exhausted patience of a man who'd already guessed the answer before he asked the question. "Did you ignore a nurse's documented warning about a deteriorating patient, then terminate her the same day for raising it?" Vale's silence answered before his words did. "I made a decision based on the clinical information I had at the time. That's not what I asked. It's the truth as I understood it." "It's a version of the truth," Henning said, leaning forward, his hands flat on the desk. "And it's about to be tested against a recorded interview from a federal hazmat commander, a published timeline from your own colleague, a falsified incident report sitting in this hospital's files, and a state investigation that's going to pull every chart, every email, every termination document this hospital has generated in the last 6 months. Do you understand the position you've put me in? Do you understand the position you've put this entire institution in? I understand it's bad. It's not bad, Preston. It's catastrophic." Henning's voice rose for the first time, cracking slightly at the edges. "We've got a reporter with documents proving retaliation against a combat veteran who turned out to be the only competent triage authority on scene during the worst disaster this county has seen in a decade. We've got a malpractice exposure on the Renner case that's now 10 times worse because it looks deliberately concealed instead of merely missed. And we've got a nursing director who falsified records to support a wrongful termination, which means our insurance carrier is going to want to know about it within the hour." He stopped, breathing hard. "This isn't a PR problem anymore. This is a hospital ending problem if we don't handle it correctly, starting tonight." What do you want me to do? I want you to understand that your position here is no longer something I can protect. Not after this. Henning's voice dropped, quieter, almost regretful in a way that made it worse. I'm placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending the medical board's findings. Carla Whitfield as well. Vale's face drained of color. You're suspending me before there's even been a hearing? I'm suspending you because 3 separate investigations are about to descend on this hospital, and I have no intention of letting your continued presence here make the damage worse than it already is. Henning stood, signaling the conversation's end. Surrender your hospital credentials at the front desk on your way out. For a moment, Vale didn't move, caught somewhere between disbelief and a fury he had nowhere left to direct. 20 years of building a reputation, dismantled in less than 36 hours by a woman he'd spent that entire time treating as beneath his notice. This isn't over, he said quietly. No, Henning agreed. It's just getting started. That's exactly the problem. Across town, inside a county emergency operations briefing room that had been repurposed for an after-action review of the Halvern plant disaster, Major Bracewell sat across the table from a state emergency management director, a woman named Pauline Atkinson, who'd been brought in specifically to assess the response's effectiveness and identify failures in the system that had allowed the initial chaos to spiral as badly as it had. Walk me through the first 90 minutes, Atkinson said, pen ready, a thick binder open in front of her. Local fire and EMS were overwhelmed almost immediately. Structural collapse, chemical fire, mass casualties, no specialized rescue equipment on scene. They needed urban search and rescue capability that was 90 minutes out at minimum. Bracewell's voice was flat, professional, the voice of a man who'd given this kind of report 100 times before in 100 different rooms. What stabilized the scene before my unit arrived was a civilian medical volunteer who happened to have combat trauma and structural collapse experience from prior military service. That's Margaret Doyle. Correct. And she organized triage, coordinated extraction sequencing, and performed advanced medical interventions, all without official authorization or current civilian licensing to do so in this jurisdiction. Bracewell's expression hardened slightly. She performed exactly the interventions necessary to keep people alive until appropriate care could be delivered. If you're asking whether that should be a problem, I'd push back hard on that framing, ma'am. I'm not suggesting it's a problem for her, Atkinson said carefully, holding up a hand. I'm asking because the after-action review needs to document a systemic gap. If a single unlicensed in this jurisdiction civilian was able to single-handedly prevent what could have been a mass fatality event, that tells me our local response infrastructure has a serious capability gap that needs addressing before the next disaster. Because we won't always have a Margaret Doyle showing up exactly when we need her. Bracewell considered that, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. That's fair. I'd agree with that. It's more than fair. It's the entire reason this review exists. Atkinson made a note, then looked up. I understand there's also a connection to a hospital personnel matter, a termination that may have been retaliatory. You'd have to ask the hospital about that. I'm asking you, Major, because your statement to the press is part of what blew the story open. Bracewell met her gaze steadily. I told the truth about who she is and what she's done. If the hospital fired her for being right about a patient, that's not my scandal to manage. That's theirs to answer for. Atkinson nodded slowly, writing something else down, the corner of her mouth tightening into something that wasn't quite a smile but carried similar weight. For what it's worth, Major, I think this review is going to recommend something that hasn't existed in this county before. A formal partnership between local emergency response and military medical reserves, specifically designed to bring people like Doyle into the system officially, instead of relying on them showing up by accident. She'd probably tell you she didn't show up by accident. She showed up because people needed help, and that's just how she's built. That's exactly why we need to make sure the system catches people like her instead of discarding them the moment they're inconvenient. Maggie's phone rang again just past 7 that evening, after she'd finally turned it back on against her better judgment. This time it wasn't a reporter. It was a number she didn't recognize, area code local. Ms. Doyle? This is Walter Henning, CEO of Harrow Memorial Hospital. She sat up straighter, surprised despite herself, surprised at how steady her own voice came out. I'm listening. I'd like to start by apologizing. Not as a public relations gesture, though I understand you'd have every right to assume that's all this is. As a personal acknowledgement that this hospital failed you badly, and that failure nearly cost a patient his life, and then compounded itself by destroying your career to cover it up. She didn't respond immediately, turning the words over, testing them for the hollowness she expected to find, and not quite locating it. That's a significant admission for a hospital CEO to make on a recorded line, she finally said. I'm aware. I'm making it anyway because the alternative is pretending this isn't happening, and I've watched that strategy fail spectacularly over the last 48 hours. Henning's voice carried genuine weariness, the kind that didn't come from a script. Dr. Vale and Ms. Whitfield have been placed on administrative leave pending state board investigations. I've ordered a full external review of every termination this hospital has processed in the past 3 years, because if this happened to you, I have no confidence it didn't happen to someone else who didn't have a federal officer willing to vouch for them on camera. That's a start. It's barely a start. I know that. He paused. I'd like to offer you reinstatement with full back pay and a formal apology issued by the hospital board. I understand if that offer feels insulting given everything that's happened. I wanted to make it regardless of how it lands. Maggie looked out at her backyard, at the fading evening light, at the small, quiet life she'd built in the aftermath of her military service, a life that had been stripped down to almost nothing by people who decided her competence was less important than their comfort. I appreciate the offer, she said slowly. I'm not interested in coming back to a building that fired me for being right. I understand, but I'd be interested in something else. The disaster review is talking about creating some kind of formal partnership between emergency response and reserve medical personnel. If Harrow Memorial wants to actually mean its apology instead of just issuing one, that's where the hospital's energy should go, not toward bringing me back, toward making sure the next person who tells an uncomfortable truth doesn't get buried for it. Henning was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she almost thought the call had dropped. I'll make sure that happens. You have my word. We'll see. She hung up, feeling something settle in her chest that wasn't quite peace, but was at least adjacent to it, close enough to let herself breathe a little easier for the first time in 3 weeks. It didn't last long. What? The call came in at 9:14 the next morning, while Maggie was sitting at her kitchen table reading through the State Nursing Board's preliminary findings that Renee had forwarded her, findings that confirmed everything Reyes had stated and recommended immediate license review for both Vale and Carla. It was Bracewell, and his voice carried none of the warmth from the day before. Doyle, I need you to listen carefully. There's been a development at Harrow Memorial. Her stomach dropped before he even finished the sentence. What kind of development? Preston Vale showed up at the hospital 20 minutes ago. He wasn't supposed to be there. He's on administrative leave, his credentials were pulled, but he used an old badge that hadn't been deactivated yet to get into the building. Security's trying to locate him now. Why does that matter? He's not authorized to treat patients. Because Caleb Renner is still recovering on the 3rd floor, Bracewell said, voice tightening with something close to alarm. And according to the duty nurse, Vale was last seen heading toward that wing before security lost track of him. The kitchen around Maggie seemed to tilt slightly, the morning's fragile calm collapsing into something sharp and cold. Has anyone called the police? Hospital security's responding now, but Doyle... Bracewell hesitated, the kind of hesitation that meant he was about to say something he didn't want to. The duty nurse said he didn't look like a man checking on a patient out of guilt. She said he looked like a man who'd already decided he had nothing left to lose. The duty nurse said he didn't look like a man checking on a patient out of guilt. She said he looked like a man who'd already decided he had nothing left to lose. Maggie was already standing, phone wedged between her ear and shoulder, grabbing her keys off the counter with hands that had gone steady the way they always did the instant a crisis stopped being theoretical. Where's 3rd floor security right now? 2 guards converging on the wing. Local PD's been called, ETA unknown. This isn't a priority dispatch yet, because nobody's confirmed a crime in progress. Bracewell's voice had the controlled clip of a man already moving, car door slamming somewhere on his end. I'm 15 minutes out. You are not authorized to be in that building, Doyle. I'm aware. I need you to hear me say that, and still understand I'm not telling you to stay home. I wasn't planning on it. She broke every reasonable speed limit getting to Harrow Memorial, replaying the geometry of the third floor in her head as she drove. The nurse's station positioned at the hub of the wing, Caleb's room 4 doors down on the left, the supply closet Vale used to disappear into when he didn't want to be found by anyone holding a complaint. She'd worked that floor for years. She knew where a desperate man would go before he knew it himself. The hospital's front entrance looked ordinary when she arrived, which felt obscene given what might be happening 4 floors up. People walking in and out with coffee cups and visitor badges, completely unaware that the building's recent history had just curdled into something with teeth. A security guard at the front desk recognized her immediately, his expression flickering through several states before landing on something like relief. "Ms. Doyle, you're not supposed to—" "Where's the third floor team?" "They lost him near the east stairwell about 4 minutes ago. We've got the elevators locked down, but the stairwell access is—" "Show me." He didn't argue. Whatever protocol existed for handling a terminated employee re-entering hospital grounds clearly hadn't anticipated a scenario where that employee was the most competent person available to handle an active threat, and the guard seemed to understand that faster than his training would have predicted. They took the stairs 2 at a time, Maggie's pulse climbing not from exertion, but from the particular cold clarity that used to settle over her right before something went wrong overseas. The sense of time narrowing, of every second mattering in ways that wouldn't be obvious until later, when it was either too late or it wasn't. On the third floor, the nurse's station had gone quiet in the wrong way, the kind of quiet that exists when people are listening hard instead of working. Renee stood near the central desk, phone pressed to her ear, relaying updates to hospital administration in a voice clipped tight with controlled panic. "He's not in his usual spots," she was saying. "We've checked the supply closet, the on-call room, the records office. Security thinks he might have gone toward—" She spotted Maggie coming through the stairwell door and nearly dropped the phone. "Maggie, what are you doing here? You can't—" "Where's Caleb's room?" 411. But the security team already checked it twice. He's not— Is anyone in the room with Caleb right now? Renee's face changed, the question landing somewhere Maggie had already gone 2 steps ahead of, and she didn't wait for an answer before moving down the hallway. Fast, controlled. The kind of pace that didn't look urgent until you noticed how much ground it covered. 411's door was closed. That alone meant something, since hospital protocol kept patient room doors cracked, unless a procedure was underway or a family wanted privacy and nobody had logged either. Maggie pushed it open without knocking. Caleb Renner sat propped up in his hospital bed, 16 years old, still pale from weeks of recovery. His expression caught somewhere between confusion and fear. Preston Vale stood beside the bed, not touching him, not doing anything overtly threatening, just standing there in street clothes instead of scrubs, an expired visitor badge clipped to his shirt, his face carrying an expression Maggie had never once seen on him in 6 years of working under his authority. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to grief. The particular grief of a man watching everything he'd built collapse, and finally understanding there was nothing left to salvage from the wreckage. "Dr. Vale," Maggie said, keeping her voice level, deliberately calm. The same register she'd have used with any volatile party in any crisis she'd ever walked into. "You shouldn't be in this room." He looked at her and something in his face cracked further. "I just wanted to see him, make sure he's actually okay. I never got to— After everything, nobody let me—" "Dr. Vale, your visit's not authorized, and Caleb's mother isn't here to consent to it." "I know that." His voice carried a brittleness that hadn't been there before, something unraveling in real time. "I know exactly what I'm not allowed to do anymore. I just wanted 30 seconds where I wasn't the villain in someone's news story. Is that so?" "Get away from him." Vale's eyes flicked toward her, and for one suspended second, something flared behind them that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. Not violence exactly, but the unpredictability of a man who'd run out of strategies and hadn't yet found the floor of his own desperation. Caleb's monitor, the one tracking his still recovering vitals, chose that exact moment to start beeping with the particular insistence of a heart rate climbing past safe parameters. The boy's fear and the tension in the room compounding into a physiological response that no amount of calm could immediately undo. "He's tachycardic," Maggie said sharply, already moving toward the bed, positioning herself between Vale and the patient with the kind of fluid, deliberate motion that wasn't accidental. "Caleb, look at me. You're safe. Breathe with me, okay? In through your nose." The boy's eyes locked onto her, recognition flickering through the fear. He'd been a patient on this floor for weeks, had likely heard staff talking about her, had probably seen the news segments his mother kept showing him. "You're the nurse," he managed. "The one from the news." "That's right, and right now I need you to breathe with me instead of focusing on anything else in this room." She kept her hand steady on his shoulder, monitoring his pulse through her fingertips while watching Vale out of the corner of her eye, every part of her trained instinct calculating distance, exits, the man's body language for any sign he was about to do something neither of them could undo. Vale hadn't moved. He stood frozen near the window, watching her work, watching the ease with which she diffused a crisis he himself had caused weeks earlier through the opposite kind of action. "I never meant for him to almost die," Vale said quietly, almost to himself. "I know that," Maggie said, not looking at him, focused on Caleb's breathing. "But meaning well doesn't undo what happened. And you being here right now, unauthorized, after everything that's come out, it's not helping him. It's not helping you either. There's nothing left that helps me." The despair in his voice carried a weight that made Renee, hovering in the doorway with the security guard now beside her, exchange a worried look. The recognition that they weren't watching a man trying to cause harm so much as a man who'd lost the architecture of his entire identity in under 48 hours and didn't yet know what remained underneath it. Caleb's heart rate steadied slowly under Maggie's continued calm coaching, dropping back towards safe territory as the immediate crisis of the moment began to settle. "Dr. Vale," Maggie said, finally turning to face him directly now that Caleb's vitals were stabilizing. "You need to leave this room. Now, before this becomes something neither of us can talk our way out of." For a moment it looked like he might refuse, some last flicker of defiance trying to assert itself against the inevitable. Then his shoulders dropped, the fight draining out of him all at once, and he walked toward the door without another word, security closing in around him the moment he crossed the threshold. Consent. The police arrived 11 minutes later, by which point Vale had been escorted to a conference room on the first floor and informed, with quiet but unmistakable finality, that his presence in the building constituted trespassing, given his suspended credentials, and that hospital administration would be deciding within the hour whether to press the issue formally. Henning arrived from his office down the hall looking like a man who'd aged 5 years since the morning's earlier crisis, standing in the doorway of the conference room studying Vale with an expression that had moved past anger into something closer to exhausted disappointment. "You used an expired badge to get into a patient's room," Henning said. "A patient at the center of a state investigation into your own conduct. I wanted to apologize to him, in person. You could have written a letter. You could have asked through legal counsel. Instead, you broke into this hospital and frightened a recovering 16-year-old badly enough to spike his heart rate." Henning's voice had gone hard. The careful diplomacy of the previous day completely evaporated. "Do you have any idea how this looks? Do you have any idea what this does to your case in front of the medical board?" Vale said nothing, staring at the table, the last threads of his composure finally completely gone. "I'm calling the board today," Henning continued, "not to wait for their scheduled review. To tell them what just happened, because I am done managing the fallout from your decisions, one crisis at a time. You're done at this hospital, Preston, not on leave. Done. I'll let the board's findings determine whether your license survives this, but as far as Harrow Memorial is concerned, this is the end." It was the kind of sentence that 6 weeks earlier would have been unthinkable. A hospital CEO, ending the career of a surgeon who'd spent 20 years cultivating the exact kind of institutional power that made people like Vale feel untouchable. Now it landed in the room with the simple, devastating weight of inevitability. The natural conclusion of a story that had started with a quiet nurse being dismissed for telling an uncomfortable truth. Vale looked up, finally, something in his expression giving way entirely. "She destroyed everything I built." "No," Henning said, standing to leave. "You destroyed it yourself, the day you decided her competence was a threat instead of an asset. Everything after that has just been the world catching up to what you already did." Outside the conference room, in a hallway that had become an impromptu gathering point for staff trying to understand what had just happened, Maggie stood near the nurse's station with Caleb's mother, Diane Renner, who'd arrived in a rush 20 minutes after the incident, face white with fear, immediately demanding to know if her son was safe. "He's fine," Maggie told her, voice steady, reassuring in the specific way she'd learned to deliver bad situations with good outcomes attached. His heart rate spiked from the stress of an unexpected visitor, but he's back to baseline. The attending's already reassessed him. Nothing's changed medically. Diane's hands were still shaking. Vale was in his room after everything that's come out about him? He's been removed from the building. He won't be back. Diane's relief gave way almost immediately to something harder, something that had clearly been building for weeks underneath the fear she'd been carrying about her son's recovery. I want to thank you, properly, not just for what happened today, for the warning you gave before any of this started. I overheard a doctor talking about it, about how you flagged it hours before. I should have said something sooner. I was just so scared, and then everything happened so fast, and I didn't know if speaking up would make things worse for Caleb. You don't owe me an apology for being scared for your son. I owe you something. Diane's voice cracked slightly. He almost died, because a surgeon decided being wrong was less important than looking right, and you tried to stop it, and they fired you for trying. Maggie didn't have a smooth answer for that, mostly because there wasn't one. No graceful response to the bare fact of what had happened. No way to make the injustice sound like anything other than exactly what it was. I'm glad he's okay, she said instead. That's the only part of this that actually matters. Diane studied her for a long moment, then reached out and gripped her hand, not letting go for several seconds, the gesture saying everything words couldn't quite manage. By that afternoon, the story had moved past local coverage entirely. A national outlet ran a feature piece tying together the disaster response, the wrongful termination, and the bizarre unauthorized hospital visit that had nearly triggered a medical emergency in a recovering minor. A sequence of events too dramatic and too clearly documented for any news desk to ignore. The state medical board, citing the trespassing incident as evidence of erratic judgment compounding the original malpractice concerns, moved to suspend Vale's license immediately rather than waiting for the scheduled hearing, a decision that arrived by certified letter at his home before the sun had even set. Carla Whitfield, facing her own investigation into the falsified incident report, resigned from her position the following morning rather than face formal termination, a resignation letter that conspicuously avoided any admission of wrongdoing, but that nobody at Harrow Memorial bothered reading past the first paragraph before processing it. Reyes, in a development nobody quite expected, was offered a formal commendation by hospital administration for his role in correcting the record. An uncomfortable kind of recognition, since it required publicly acknowledging that the only reason his commendation existed was because he'd helped expose a cover-up he'd participated in 3 weeks earlier. He accepted it anyway, understanding that redemption rarely arrived clean, and that the alternative, continued silence, had already cost more than he was willing to keep paying. Maggie watched all of it unfold from a careful distance, declining most interview requests, granting only the one she'd already promised to Joelle Marsh, keeping her public statements brief and unsentimental in a way that frustrated reporters looking for a more dramatic angle, but that felt, to her, like the only honest way to handle a story that had never been about her seeking attention in the first place. People keep asking me how it feels to be vindicated, she told Joelle during their second, shorter conversation, sitting on her own back porch this time instead of speaking by phone. I don't really have a good answer. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like proof finally existing for something that was always true. Does it feel like justice? Maggie considered that for a long moment. Justice would have been nobody having to almost die for the truth to matter. This is just what happens after justice fails the first time. It's better than nothing. It's not the same thing as right. The quote ran in Joelle's follow-up piece, and it traveled further than almost anything else in the entire saga, because it captured something most of the previous coverage had missed entirely. The exhaustion underneath the vindication, the cost of having to fight this publicly just to receive treatment that should have been automatic from the start. 3 days after the hospital incident, Major Bracewell showed up at Maggie's house unannounced, carrying a folder thick enough that she knew immediately it wasn't a social visit. County Emergency Management finalized their after-action recommendations, he said, settling into the same backyard chair he'd occupied days earlier. They're creating a formal reserve medical response program. Trained civilian military liaisons, embedded with local emergency services, specifically designed to deploy during exactly the kind of disaster that just happened here. That's good, necessary, honestly. They want you to run it. Maggie's eyebrows rose. Run it, not just consult. Director of the program. Full authority over training standards, deployment protocols, recruitment criteria. They've seen what you're capable of under conditions most administrators only encounter in disaster simulations, and they don't want to lose that capability the next time something like Halvern plant happens. Bracewell slid the folder across the table. It's a real position, real funding, state level, not just county. She opened the folder slowly, scanning the proposal. Salary figures, organizational charts. A mission statement built almost entirely around the principle that competence shouldn't depend on luck. That the next disaster shouldn't have to rely on someone with her exact background happening to live 15 miles away and happening to turn on the news at the right moment. What about Harrow Memorial's offer? Reinstatement? You can do both, technically, or neither. It's your call. Bracewell watched her carefully. But I'll be honest, Doyle. I think you already know which one actually matters to you. Going back to a hospital that fired you, even with an apology attached, means working inside the same system that almost let a kid die because somebody's ego mattered more than his life. This, he tapped the folder, means building something that makes that kind of failure structurally harder to repeat. Maggie stared at the proposal for a long time, feeling something settle into place that had been unmoored since the day Carla had walked her out of the hospital under security escort 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. I need to think about it, she said. But I think you already know which way I'm leaning. I do. I just wanted to see your face when you said it. She almost smiled, the first real one in days. You're a pain in my ass, Bracewell. You'd have fired me from your unit if I wasn't. The State Medical Board's formal hearing for Preston Vale convened 6 days later, a proceeding open to the public that drew a small but pointed crowd, local journalists, hospital staff who'd taken personal days specifically to attend, and Diane Renner, sitting in the front row with her arms crossed, watching the man who'd nearly let her son die explain himself to a panel that had already, functionally, decided his fate. Vale's attorney argued mitigating circumstances, pointed to 20 years of otherwise clean practice, suggested that a single catastrophic error in judgment shouldn't define an entire career. The board chair, a sharp-eyed physician named Dr. Outerbridge, who'd clearly reviewed every piece of evidence with exacting attention, was unmoved. Dr. Vale, she said, this board isn't simply evaluating a single clinical error. We're evaluating a clinical error, followed by retaliatory termination of the colleague who correctly identified it, followed by falsification of records to conceal that retaliation, followed by an unauthorized and disruptive visit to the recovering patient at the center of this entire matter. That is not a single lapse in judgment. That is a pattern of conduct demonstrating a fundamental unwillingness to accept accountability when it threatens your authority. I take full responsibility for... You took responsibility 3 weeks too late, and only after a federal officer, a journalist, and a junior colleague forced the truth into public view, despite your active efforts to suppress it. Outerbridge's voice was flat, final. This board is suspending your medical license indefinitely, pending a minimum 2-year review period during which reinstatement will require demonstrated remediation and independent psychological evaluation, effective immediately. The gavel-equivalent silence that followed carried more weight than any actual sound could have. Vale sat motionless, his attorney already gathering papers, the small crowd in the gallery exchanging glances that mixed satisfaction with something more somber. The recognition that watching a man's career end, even one who'd earned it, didn't feel quite like triumph so much as the closing of an ugly, necessary chapter. Diane Renner stood up before the room had fully cleared, walking directly toward Vale as he gathered his things, ignoring his attorney's attempt to intercept her. "My son almost died," she said, voice shaking with restrained fury, "because you couldn't stand being wrong about something a nurse told you in plain English." Vale looked at her, and for the first time in the entire proceeding, something in his face actually cracked into genuine remorse instead of performed contrition. "I know. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything." "No," she said. "It doesn't." She turned and walked away without waiting for a response, and Vale stood alone in the emptying hearing room, finally, completely stripped of the authority that had defined every interaction he'd ever had with the people beneath him. That evening, Maggie sat across from Walter Henning at a small cafe near the hospital, a meeting she'd agreed to mostly out of curiosity about what remained for the institution to say to her after everything that had already happened. The board's external review of our termination records is finished, Henning said, sliding a thin folder across the table. 2 other cases? Different departments, same pattern, employees raising legitimate safety concerns, getting labeled difficult or insubordinate, getting pushed out instead of heard. Maggie scanned the names, unfamiliar to her, the details disturbingly familiar regardless. What's the hospital doing about it? Both employees have been offered reinstatement and back pay. We're also implementing a mandatory anonymous escalation channel for clinical safety concerns, something that bypasses direct supervisors entirely if a staff member feels their concern isn't being taken seriously. Henning paused. It's not enough. I know that. But it's something concrete instead of another apology. It's a start, Maggie said, echoing the same words she'd used on their first call, though this time they carried less skepticism than before. There's one more thing. Henning's expression shifted into something more careful. The board's reviewing whether to name the new emergency partnership program after the incident that created it. They're calling it the Renner Protocol, internally, for now. A formal commitment that flagged patient deterioration gets mandatory secondary review regardless of who raises it or what their title is. No physician can dismiss a nursing concern without documented justification reviewed by a second attending. Maggie absorbed that, feeling something genuinely surprising move through her. Not pride exactly, but something close to it. The recognition that the worst weeks of her professional life had produced a structural change that might actually outlast the headlines, might actually protect the next nurse who found herself standing in the same position she'd stood in, watching a doctor dismiss something that mattered. That's good, she said quietly. That's actually good. I thought you'd want to know, regardless of whether you ever set foot in this building again. Henning studied her for a moment. For what it's worth, I don't think this hospital deserves credit for what came out of this. We didn't choose accountability. It got forced on us. But I'd rather build something useful out of the wreckage than waste the opportunity pretending none of it happened. Maggie nodded slowly, finishing her coffee, thinking about the folder Bracewell had left with her 3 days earlier, about the position waiting for her answer, about Caleb Renner recovering upstairs in a building that had nearly killed him and was now, slowly, awkwardly, trying to become something better. She still hadn't given Bracewell her final answer, but sitting there, hearing Henning describe a protocol bearing a frightened teenager's name, something in her finally settled into certainty. She wasn't going back to Harrow Memorial. She was building something the hospital should have built years ago, something bigger than one building's reputation. Something that didn't depend on luck and proximity the next time a chemical plant 15 miles from anywhere decided to fail. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from Renee. You need to see this, now. Attached was a screenshot of a press release just issued by the State Attorney General's office announcing a formal investigation, not just into Harrow Memorial's termination practices, but into a pattern of similar retaliatory dismissals across 4 other hospitals in the regional health network, all flagged after investigators began pulling records in the wake of Maggie's case. The story wasn't just about one hospital anymore. It had just become something far larger, far more dangerous for a lot more people than Preston Vale. And Maggie understood, reading the release a second time with her coffee going cold in her hand, that whatever came next was going to demand far more from her than she'd given so far. The story wasn't just about one hospital anymore. It had just become something far larger, far more dangerous for a lot more people than Preston Vale. And Maggie understood, reading the release a second time with her coffee going cold in her hand, that whatever came next was going to demand far more from her than she'd given so far. She set the phone down and looked at Henning, who was watching her face with the careful attention of a man trying to gauge how much worse his morning was about to get. You knew about this, she said. I got a courtesy call an hour before the release went out. Henning rubbed his eyes, the exhaustion of the past weeks finally catching up to him in a way that made him look older than he had the first time she'd met him. 4 other hospitals in the network. Same pattern, apparently. Nurses, techs, a respiratory therapist in one case, all terminated within days of raising concerns that turned out to be correct. The AG's office wants to know if it's coincidence or culture. You already know the answer to that. I do. Doesn't make it easier to say out loud. He pushed his own cup aside, untouched. They're going to want you to testify, probably more than once. You understand that, right? This isn't ending with Vale's license. Maggie sat back, feeling the shape of the next several months settle over her like a weight she hadn't asked for and couldn't put down now that she'd seen it clearly. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a woman quietly disappearing from a job she loved, telling herself the silence was just exhaustion. Now she was sitting in a cafe being told a state investigation needed her voice to hold together. "I'll testify," she said, "whatever they need, even though it means this doesn't end for you anytime soon." It was never going to end quietly. I think I knew that the day Bracewell said my name out loud in front of his unit. She managed a tired half smile. Might as well make it count for more than just me. The Attorney General's investigation moved with a speed that surprised even the people who'd requested it, fueled by a public already primed by Maggie's story to recognize the shape of institutional cowardice the moment it appeared again somewhere else. Within 2 weeks, internal documents from 3 of the 4 flagged hospitals had been subpoenaed. Within 3, a respiratory therapist named Owen Marsh, no relation to Joelle, a coincidence that journalists kept awkwardly clarifying every time they mentioned both names in the same article, came forward publicly, describing his own termination 18 months earlier after flagging a ventilator settings error that had nearly killed a post-operative patient. "I thought I was the only one," he told a local reporter, standing outside a courthouse in a county 40 miles from Colton, his voice catching slightly on camera in a way that made the clip spread almost as fast as Maggie's original story had. "I thought maybe I really had done something wrong, the way they kept telling me. Watching what happened with Ms. Doyle, I finally understood. It wasn't me. It was never me." Maggie watched that interview from her kitchen, feeling something complicated tighten in her chest. Not surprise exactly, since she'd long suspected her situation wasn't unique, but a deeper, more uncomfortable recognition of how many people had likely absorbed the same lie Owen Marsh had absorbed. The lie that said, you must have done something wrong, because surely an institution wouldn't simply discard a person for being right. Renee showed up that evening with takeout. Neither of them touched much, settling into the worn kitchen chairs that had become the unofficial headquarters of processing the last 6 weeks. "You look tired," Renee said. "I am tired." "Good tired or bad tired?" Maggie considered the question seriously, turning her water glass in slow circles on the table. Tired like something's finally working the way it's supposed to, after years of watching it not work and telling myself that was just how things were. She looked up. "Is that a kind of tired that makes sense?" "It makes a lot of sense." Renee reached across the table, squeezing her hand briefly. "For what it's worth, half the staff at Harrow Memorial talk about you differently now. Not like the difficult nurse who got herself fired, like," she searched for the word, "like someone who was right the whole time and just had the bad luck of being right around people too insecure to handle it." "That's a generous way to put it. It's the true way to put it. I just took longer to say it because I felt guilty for not saying it sooner." Renee's voice dropped, something more vulnerable surfacing underneath the lighter tone she'd been holding all evening. "I should have backed you up when Carla started asking questions. I knew something was off, and I stayed quiet because I didn't want to be next. You don't owe me an apology for being scared. Everyone there was scared. That was the whole problem. Doesn't make it feel less like I failed you." Maggie reached across the table this time, covering Renee's hand with her own. "You're here now. You said something when it mattered, eventually. That's what actually counts. I'm not interested in keeping score on who was brave enough soon enough. I spent too many years measuring myself against impossible standards other people set for me. I'm done doing that to anyone else." The formal offer from the State Emergency Management Office arrived in writing 8 days later, and Maggie signed it on a Tuesday morning at the same kitchen table where the entire upheaval had effectively begun, Bracewell sitting across from her as a witness, more out of sentiment than necessity. "Director of the Statewide Reserve Medical Response Program," he read aloud from the cover letter, grinning despite himself. "Has a hell of a ring to it. It has a hell of a budget line attached too, which is the part that actually matters for getting anything built." "Don't undersell yourself, Doyle. The ring matters." He watched her sign the last page, something genuinely moved passing behind his usual gruff exterior. "You know what this means, right? You're not just fixing what happened to you anymore. You're building the thing that makes sure it can't happen the same way to the next person." "That's the idea. It's a good idea. I just want you to actually let it land instead of treating it like another mission to execute and move past." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice losing some of its usual gruffness. You earned this, not because of what happened at the plant, because of every year before that, every patient nobody else caught, every time you did the job right while everybody else got the credit for it, or worse, got nothing said about it at all. Maggie set down the pen, looking at the signed contract, feeling something unfamiliar settle into her chest. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but something steadier than either, something that felt like the floor finally holding weight after years of testing whether it would. Thank you, she said quietly. For Kandahar, for showing up at the plant, for all of it. Don't thank me. You did the work. I just made sure people couldn't pretend they hadn't seen it. He paused, studying her face. There's a difference, you know, between people who do good work quietly and people who let themselves get erased while doing it. You used to be both. I'm glad you're only the first one now. She didn't have an answer for that right away, mostly because it landed somewhere true enough to sting a little, somewhere she hadn't fully examined herself yet. The program launched its first formal training cohort 6 weeks later, held in a converted county training facility that smelled like fresh paint and ambition. 22 participants pulled from a mix of military reserve medical personnel, veteran nurses, and a handful of civilian EMTs who'd applied after seeing news coverage of the Halvern plant disaster. Maggie stood in front of the room on the first morning, feeling the particular vertigo of occupying a role she'd never imagined for herself. Not the quiet nurse who stayed in her lane, not the combat medic who simply executed orders, but someone whose voice now carried structural weight, whose judgment shaped policy instead of getting overruled by it. Most of you have a story like mine, she told the room. No notes, no script, just the plain truth she'd learned to say out loud over the past 2 months. A moment where you knew something was wrong, said so clearly, and watched someone with more authority and less information decide they knew better. Some of you got listened to eventually. Some of you got pushed out the door for trying. She paused, scanning the room, recognizing pieces of her own exhaustion in more faces than she expected. This program exists because that gap between knowing and being heard gets people killed. Our job isn't just clinical competence. It's making sure competence doesn't get silenced by ego, by hierarchy, by somebody's discomfort with being wrong. A young Army reservist near the front raised her hand. What happens when we get pushback? When the people we're working alongside don't want to hear it, the way it sounds like happened to you? Maggie considered the question carefully, unwilling to offer false comfort. You document everything. You say it clearly, once, with specifics, and you say it again if you have to, because saying it once and giving up isn't the same as actually speaking up. And then you trust that eventually, the truth has a way of outliving whoever's trying to bury it. It took weeks for mine to surface. It shouldn't have taken that long. A kid almost died waiting for it. But it surfaced. She held the room's attention without effort, the authority in her voice coming from something far more durable than rank. That's the whole point of what we're building here. A system where you don't have to wait for a federal officer to vouch for you on camera before anyone takes your word seriously. Another hand went up, this one belonging to an older man in the back, a retired Navy corpsman who'd been quiet for most of the morning. What if it cost you everything? Your job, your reputation, the way people look at you afterward? Maggie didn't flinch from the question, didn't dress it up with something easier to hear. Then it costs you everything, and you survive that, and you find out what's actually left underneath. I lost a job I loved. I lost 3 weeks where I genuinely didn't know if I'd done the wrong thing by speaking up at all. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it doesn't hurt or that it always works out the way mine did. Sometimes the truth doesn't make the news. Sometimes nobody shows up with cameras. Her voice softened slightly, the performance falling away into something more honest. But I'd still rather be the person who said something and lost a job than the person who stayed quiet and lost a patient. That's the only math that's ever made sense to me. The room sat with that for a moment. The silence different from the kind that used to follow her warnings at Harrow Memorial. Not dismissive, but absorbing, weighing, taking the words seriously in a way she still wasn't fully used to. Preston Vale's name appeared in the news one final time, roughly 4 months after the disaster, in a brief item announcing that the state medical board had formally denied his petition for early license reinstatement, citing insufficient evidence of remediation and a continued failure to demonstrate accountability beyond carefully worded legal statements drafted by counsel rather than offered in his own words. He'd moved out of Colton by then, relocating to a smaller town 2 states over where, according to a single follow-up piece nobody outside the immediate area paid much attention to, he was reportedly working in hospital administration consulting, a role that didn't require an active medical license, a role that kept him technically employed while permanently distant from the kind of clinical authority he'd once wielded without question. Maggie heard about it secondhand through Renee, who still kept loose tabs on the old Harrow Memorial gossip network out of habit more than malice. "Does it bother you?" Renee asked one evening, the two of them sitting on Maggie's back porch as autumn finally started cooling the air, that he's not, destroyed? That he's still working, even if it's not as a surgeon? Maggie thought about the question seriously before answering, turning it over the way she turned over most things now, with more patience than she used to have. "I used to think justice meant watching someone burn down to nothing," she said. "I don't think that anymore. I think justice is making sure the system that let him get away with it for 20 years doesn't exist in the same shape it used to. He lost the thing he built his whole identity around. That's not nothing. Whether he ever finds peace with it isn't really my responsibility to manage. That's more grace than I'd manage. It's not grace, it's just I don't have room left to carry hatred for him on top of everything else I'm trying to build." She looked out at the darkening yard, voice quieter now. "Anger's heavy, Renee. Eventually you have to decide if you want to keep carrying it everywhere you go or set it down and use both hands for something else. I chose the something else. Most days, anyway. I won't pretend there aren't bad nights." Caleb Renner's recovery, by late autumn, had progressed to the point where he was back in school full-time, his scar healing into a thin line he'd later half-joke about showing off at the beach, the kind of dark humor teenagers develop as armor against things that genuinely terrified them once. Diane Renner invited Maggie to a small dinner at their house in October, a gesture that felt less like obligation and more like a family trying to formally close a chapter that had nearly ended in tragedy. "He talks about you sometimes," Diane said quietly in the kitchen, while Caleb showed Bracewell, invited along somewhat unexpectedly, somewhat fittingly, since the two had struck up an odd friendship over video games during one of Maggie's earlier visits, a game in the next room. "Says he wants to go into emergency medicine someday. Paramedic, maybe. Says watching what you did changed how he thinks about what bravery actually looks like." Maggie felt something catch in her throat, unexpected and sudden. That's a lot of pressure to put on a 16-year-old's career plans. Maybe. Or maybe it's exactly the kind of thing that should follow someone for the rest of their life, watching the system almost fail them and then watching one person refuse to let it. Diane studied her for a long moment, her expression carrying both gratitude and something heavier underneath it, the lingering residue of fear that hadn't fully left her even months later. "I know you don't like being thanked. I'm going to do it anyway, because I think you need to hear it more than you let yourself believe you do." "Well, you try..." "I hear you." "Good. Now eat something. You've gotten too thin running this program of yours." Maggie laughed, the sound surprising her with how easily it came, how unguarded, something she hadn't managed in months before the disaster, back when every conversation at Harrow Memorial had carried the low, constant hum of being underestimated and unheard. Later that evening, standing in the doorway as she left, Caleb caught her arm gently. "Hey, I wanted to say thanks for real, not just because my mom's making you stay for dinner." "You don't have to thank me, Caleb." "I know. I'm doing it anyway." He shrugged, suddenly looking younger than his 16 years, the bravado falling away. "Everyone kept telling me I was fine, that the doctors had it handled. You were the only one who actually looked at me like something was really wrong. That stuck with me. I think about it a lot." She didn't have a smooth response for that, so she just nodded, the weight of his words settling somewhere she'd carry for a long time after. By the time the program's first cohort graduated in December, the statewide partnership had already drawn interest from 2 neighboring states looking to replicate the model, and Bracewell had quietly submitted Maggie's name for a federal advisory position on disaster medical response standards, a nomination she hadn't asked for and initially resisted, until he pointed out, with the particular bluntness she'd always respected in him, that resisting recognition wasn't humility, It was just another version of staying small to avoid making anyone uncomfortable. You spent your whole career being right and quiet, he told her over coffee the week before the graduation ceremony. Maybe it's time to be right and loud for a while. See how that feels. It feels exposed. Good things usually do the first few times. She accepted the nomination. The graduation ceremony itself was modest by design. No national press, no elaborate staging, just 22 newly certified reserve medical responders standing in a community-centered gymnasium in front of family, colleagues, and a small contingent of local officials who'd finally understood, 4 months too late for some people, but exactly in time for others, what it cost a community to lose someone's competence to institutional ego. Maggie stood at the podium, looking out at faces that included Renee, Bracewell, Diane, and Caleb Renner sitting near the back, and Reyes, who'd quietly applied to volunteer with the program's medical advisory board after his own reckoning with what silence had cost everyone, standing near the side exit like he wasn't sure he'd earned the right to be there yet, but had come anyway. 6 months ago, she said, her voice steady despite the unfamiliar weight of an audience that actually wanted to hear what she had to say, I was a nurse who got fired for telling the truth about a patient. I spent 3 weeks afterward thinking the worst part wasn't losing my job. It was wondering if maybe I'd been wrong all along to think competence mattered more than convenience. If maybe the people who'd spent years telling me to stay in my lane actually understood something about the world that I didn't. She paused, scanning the room, finding Caleb's face, finding the steady, grounding presence of people who'd fought alongside her through every stage of the past half year. I was wrong about that. Competence does matter more than convenience. Truth does outlast whoever's trying to bury it, even when it takes longer than it should, even when it costs more than it should. Her voice carried clear across the gymnasium. No tremor in it now, nothing left of the woman who'd once swallowed her objections in hospital hallways to keep the peace. What happened to me wasn't about being a hero during a disaster. Anyone can rise to an emergency once. What actually mattered was refusing to disappear quietly afterward, refusing to let people decide my silence was the price of their comfort. That's the lesson I want every one of you to carry out of this room. Being right isn't enough. You have to be willing to stay loud about it, even when staying quiet would be so much easier. She looked at the new graduates, at the careful, hopeful determination on faces that reminded her of herself years earlier, before institutions had taught her that speaking up came with a price tag most people weren't willing to pay. The people who tried to erase me thought they were getting rid of a problem, she said, voice dropping into something quieter, more personal, the closing thought she'd been building toward without fully realizing it until the words arrived. What they actually did was force the truth into the open, and the truth built something bigger than any of us expected, something that's going to outlast every person in this room, including me. That's not revenge. I stopped wanting revenge somewhere around month 3 of this. It's just what happens when you refuse to let dismissal be the end of your story instead of the beginning of a better one. She let that settle for a moment before continuing, her gaze drifting briefly to the back of the room where Diane sat with her hand resting on her son's shoulder. I used to think the bravest thing I ever did was come home from 2 deployments in one piece. I don't think that anymore either. The bravest thing I've ever done was stand in a hallway and say a patient was dying when every person above me said I was wrong, knowing exactly what it would probably cost me, and doing it anyway. If there's one thing I want you to take out of this building today, it's that. Not the rank, not the training, just the willingness to say the hard thing out loud, even quietly, even once, even when nobody's listening yet, because eventually somebody will. The room rose to its feet before she'd even finished, and Maggie stood there for a moment, letting it happen, letting herself feel the specific hard-won weight of being seen exactly as she was, instead of dismissed for being inconvenient, not triumphant, not vindicated in the way revenge stories promised, but something quieter and more durable than either. Afterward, in the parking lot, as families filtered out into the cold December evening, Bracewell caught up with her near her car, hands in his jacket pockets, breath visible in the chilled air. "You did good in there," he said. "I almost didn't say any of it. Had a whole different version written that was a lot more boring. Glad you scrapped it." He looked at her for a long moment, something almost paternal in his expression despite being barely older than her. "You know what the hell of it is? You were always like this. Same person who kept 3 of my idiots breathing in the back of a Humvee. The only thing that changed is people finally had to stop ignoring it. Maggie looked back toward the gymnasium, toward the lights still glowing warm against the early dark, toward the life she'd built out of the wreckage of the one that had been taken from her. Maybe that's the whole point, she said. Not that I became someone new, just that the world finally caught up to who I already was. She'd spent years being underestimated by people who mistook her silence for smallness. She'd learned, finally, the difference between staying quiet to keep the peace and staying quiet because nobody had ever bothered asking what she actually knew. She wasn't quiet anymore. And standing in that parking lot, watching 22 new responders walk out into a system finally built to listen to them, she understood that neither would they be.